hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid. The hybrid.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Hybrid, the podcast where we unpack the policy, politics, and sometimes plain absurdity of cannabis regulation. Today we're diving into a topic that doesn't always grab headlines, but certainly shapes how well or how poorly cannabis markets function, and that topic is transparency. Now, transparency may sound vague, well-intentioned, easy to ignore, but when it comes to state cannabis agencies, transparency isn't just a buzzword. It's one of the few tools we have to build public trust, ensure accountability, and this part's underrated, how it can actually make the whole thing work. Let's start with what we're really talking about. In cannabis, transparency shows up in a bunch of different ways. It's publishing licensing data in an accessible format. It's releasing inspection reports. It's explaining why a rule changed or why it didn't. It's being honest about challenges, timelines, and decisions. It's telling the public, here's how we regulate this industry, and most importantly, why. But let's be honest, transparency means exposing yourself to criticism, especially when the system isn't perfect and none are. State cannabis programs are often underfunded, understaffed, and operate in political environments that deliver less than desirable starting points. But here's the thing. When you don't show your work, people assume the worst. They assume the system's rigged or broken or both. I know that tension firsthand. As a former state regulator, I get why folks hesitate to be fully transparent. We're often flying the plane while building it. Sometimes we're on a deadline with 4 people doing the work of 20. Sometimes we're just trying to keep the wheels from falling off, and explaining every move seems like a joke. But at the end of the day, the public should know what's happening and why. And here's what I haven't said yet. Transparency done right actually helps. It earns trust. It gives policymakers confidence in our agencies. It signals to good actors that the rules are real and being enforced fairly. It brings daylight to the dark places where special interests like to lurk. And maybe most importantly, especially in a complex industry, it invites better ideas. Now, today's guest knows a lot about this, but from a different angle. He understands how transparency makes the whole thing work. Steve Kemmerling is the founder and CEO of CRB Monitor. If you haven't heard of CRB Monitor, that's fine, but you're about to understand why they're one of the most important companies that help make the whole thing work. CRB Monitor works behind the scenes to help banks, credit unions, and other financial institutions identify and manage their exposure to cannabis-related businesses. That's a big deal, because without accurate, up-to-date data on who's licensed, who's legit, who's doing what, banks are stuck in the dark. And when banks are stuck in the dark, they don't serve the cannabis industry, and if they do, they charge outrageous fees to make up for that risk. What CRB Monitor does is essentially bring clarity to a murky space. But to do it, they need reliable, transparent data from state agencies. They rely on clear licensing information, not just who has a license, but what kind, where, and what activity. When that information isn't public or buried in PDFs scattered across a number of different systems, the entire financial ecosystem in cannabis suffers. So today we're going to be talking with Steve about how agency transparency, or the lack thereof, ripples far beyond just policy nerds and FOA junkies. It impacts who gets access to banking, who can operate above board, and who's stuck operating in the gray, or worse, the illicit market. But before we go to Steve, I have a question for my friend and co-host, Shawn Collins. You and I have talked about this before. We've talked about it quite a bit. And I think we're pretty well aligned on the idea of transparency. More of it is better than not enough of it. So my question for you, in running the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission and launching it, early on, how did you envision transparency, and what was your approach to transparency in general, launching what I'm guessing at the time was the newest state agency or independent commission in Massachusetts?
Yeah. Look, that's a great question. It's something we thought a lot about, knowing a couple things. One was we had no credibility as an agency. And to your point in your monologue, which again, out of the park, nailed it.
Got it.
That was something that sort of it as we were dwelling on how do you build credibility and how do you build a reputation, I think sharing as much information and as much information about how you arrive at decisions is critical to that endeavor. And so the challenge we actually had to figure out was how much transparency is too much transparency in a way. As like, you can't make every single decision in public, or you can't invite the public into every room that you're having a conversation in, because there's also danger in that of like an idea becoming attributable to you, or knowing that like as you brainstorm things and as you go through an exercise of like which options 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which one's the best one, that means someone's going to think the options 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the worst ideas they've ever heard, and how could you possibly imagine doing that? And so we really struggled with, and this was, I give credit to both the legislature as well as the first iteration of the commission. They had countless public meetings where their deliberations were available and people could come and sit and listen. I do think you end up with some performance to that, of like, there's a camera running, so I better be on script and better be sort of camera ready. And then the other thing was just data and making sure that we were able to publish as much data as possible. And I held this theory that I used to call it sort of a don't take my word for it system. And it was like, let me just publish all of our records and sort of our data. Let me anticipate public records, to your point on FOIA and public records.
Yeah.
Let me anticipate what those needs are going to be and publish it on our website directly. We were pretty proud of our open data platform. Ironically, at one point in my tenure, I was like, hey, this to the team, I'm like, our open data platform hasn't been updated in like a couple of weeks. Like, is there like a glitch in the system? And like, oh no, we got to run that report down from, I think it was like Metric or something. And then we got to scrub it and then we'll publish it. I was like, well, wait a minute. I thought we had an open data strategy. Well, right. But it's a manual, we have to run the report and then we review it. I'm like, yeah, but it's open data. Why are we scrubbing anything? Or what are we doing? And then it sort of dawned on me. I'm like, we might want to rethink our open data strategy if that's what we have to do to update it. But I think to your point and the monologue again, it's transparency for me is one of those buzzwords that it's like a paper cut sometimes whenever I hear it, because I just think people assign their own definition to it. It's like, you're not being transparent enough. And my reaction to that is like, I'm never going to meet your standard. However, I can aspire to be as transparent as is feasible, knowing that we also have business decisions to make and really need to get into just the nuts and bolts of bureaucracy sometimes, which requires, frankly, a camera to not be present or someone to not be invited to the room, because you've got to make some difficult decisions sometimes too. And also keep in mind, you and I, in licensing people, like we were dealing with background checks and suitability and people's criminal history and some stuff, and also medical patients and protecting their privacy and those sorts of things. Not to mention, these were cash-only businesses at the outset, and public safety matters as far as, if there's one store open in an entire county and someone wants the sales data in that store, like that's really relevant information for the person that's been casing the joint too. And so I think it's always going to be an evergreen balance of transparency. And if your goal is to meet the public expectation, I would say good luck to you, because that's always going to be a bar too high sometimes. So
yeah, for certain people, but I think in the general public, you can meet that threshold. And I always forget too.
That's the cynic in me, I guess.
We have two different perspectives. Well, I don't want to say two different perspectives, but you had that added layer of transparency and the fact that you had commissioners and held commission meetings, these public meetings. Because when I think about it, I think about, all right, what action are we taking internally, and how are we letting everybody know about it via external dashboards, making public all these reports, all the stuff that we're going to talk to Steve about. But you had to have a lot of difficult policy, regulatory conversations in front of the public, which I didn't have to do in Maine, which I think, going back to I think that cuts both ways, right? Sometimes that could be the result of not as great policy, but you have that added layer of transparency in there. And I think we were both aligned in, like, I always felt, even from day one, more transparency, the better. One, I had like, yeah, it can come back and bite you in the butt. But one, I had like confidence in myself. I had confidence in the staff that I had brought in to do this work with me. And I almost felt like, well, one, it was to like get ahead of all these FOA requests, but the other was it's almost like the biggest cover your ass move ever, just by pushing out like, you can't come back 6 months later. Like, you knew we did X, Y, and Z 6 months ago. Why do you know? Because we published it. We put it in a report. It was in this, it's on our external facing dashboard for all these things. So I think generally speaking, yeah, more transparency, the better.
You also get to deputize people, the public.
Yeah.
You put data out there, you put raw data out there, someone's going to find the nugget or the needle in that haystack. And it may not be your team, and that's okay, because again, especially as you're building an agency, as you and I both were, you're trying to scale that alongside the industry that's growing just as fast. And so the more hands, the more eyes you can get on data, someone's going to take the time to put it through some sort of system and find that nugget of information that is either really, really helpful or frankly reveals something that needs addressing. So for me, I wasn't shy about the data. And also the benefit you and I had too, and this is sort of inside bureaucracy a little bit, I wasn't dealing with any legacy data. I didn't inherit an agency that had an old system that I had to migrate all the, so starting from scratch, publish it all, release it all. And again, just let the people see it, because again, for me, it was, don't take my word for it. This is what we're doing. And this is, let the data prove it. And if evaluate us based on that objective standard too, by the way, license process times, those sorts of things, like evaluate us. Here's the criteria you need to do it though.
Yeah, I hear that. And hopefully Steve will be able to tell us if we did a good job in Maine, in Massachusetts, around being transparent. But see, before we jump into transparency as it pertains to the work that you do, CRB Monitor does around supporting financial institutions, is there anything that I missed in the beautiful monologue that I put together earlier this morning around yourself or the work that you're doing at CRB Monitor?
No, it was big and beautiful. It was,
just like a couple bills that are pending.
Yeah. Okay, so we're talking about transparency and cannabis banking issue for years. We've known each other for years. We've been working together for a long time. We've had this conversation 100 different ways, but where do things actually stand today around transparency as it relates to the work that you do? And are we any closer to solving the cannabis banking problem, or are we just kind of talking in circles at this point?
Yeah. So, first of all, I am going to jump ahead a little bit. Not that we are going to get into the minutia of the Transparency Scorecard, but CRB Monitor is working on a report analysis where we do attempt to fairly represent, from our point of view, how transparent each agency is, each cannabis agency is being. And this is all relative in the context of data that regulated financial institutions need, or we think they need, to safely bank cannabis. And for what it's worth, we kind of have three main categories, and the highest possible score is 15. And Massachusetts, this is today, not when you guys were, at your respective agencies, but
How do I
today,
add the drum roll
Massachusetts is a
sound
14
effect?
out of 15.
14?
And Maine's out of 15 out of 15. So you guys did some good work, and I'm not pandering.
Recount.
I'm not pandering.
Typical. Maine comes out on top. Let's go.
And
nothing else to
yeah,
do.
so to kind of answer the broader question as it relates to cannabis businesses' access to banking, I want to define that as relatively basically to still access to basic checking accounts, ability to move money, write checks. Relative to when I started the CRB Monitor in 2014, it's vastly improved. Has there been a big improvement since 12 months ago? It's probably about the same. But generally, most direct cannabis-related businesses that want a FDI insured or NCUA insured depository account can get an account. Generally, um, there might be some or are some kind of geographical pockets where that's easier said than done. In more rural states, Montana, North Dakota, where there's just fewer banks and fewer bank branches. But generally, it is somewhat business as usual to get a cannabis checking account, bank account.
And I feel like I should take a step back and understand that the listeners may not have a clear understanding here. So at its most fundamental level, CRB Monitor is collecting licensing data points from cannabis state agencies, kind of going through it, standardizing it, giving it to the financial institutions that need that information so they're accountable to their federal regulators. Because there is FinCEN guidance. There is guidance from federal regulators like, listen, if you are going to do cannabis banking, you need to do X, Y, and Z to be square with us. So at a more fundamental level, what type of information, Steve, are you looking to get from cannabis agencies in order to support these financial institutions? And then the second part of that question would be, how in the real world are these banks and credit unions actually using that data to check those boxes?
Yeah, it really isn't that complex in theory. Just to clarify a little bit further, an alphabet soup of U.S. banking regulation. That
Yeah.
there's a Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, wherever that name came from. It's a unit, Department of Treasury. It goes by FinCEN. And FinCEN basically oversees and enforces anti-money laundering rules and regulations at banks and credit unions in the United States. They basically, this is what you need to do as a regulated financial institution to ensure you have robust enough policies and procedures to prevent and or identify money laundering at your institution. So in 2014, FinCEN came out with marijuana banking guidance, and we were going to flip between marijuana and cannabis. From my perspective, when I say cannabis, I'm really referring to marijuana at this point. But they came out with literally, marijuana banking guidance or guidelines. And those guidelines said, basically use publicly available data to identify and understand the nature of the marijuana businesses that your institution is choosing to knowingly work with. So there's 3 or 4 buckets that we think about, and these are all literally bullet pointed in this 7 or 8 page guidance document. Who are the businesses? Literally, what are the names of the businesses? What do they do? And we interpret that to mean, okay, they licensed to be a cultivator? Are they a wholesaler? Are they a retailer? We include testing labs because generally they're licensed by marijuana or cannabis agencies. Are they wholesalers, et cetera, et cetera? So what do they do? Who owns them? The concept there is beneficial owner, so a little bit of a technical term, but basically who are the controlling persons that pull the levers and turn the knobs at a business that are controlling persons. So you have business entity data, licensing data, license specific data, not just that it's a marijuana business, but it has a license or licenses of this type with this status on this day. Beneficial ownership. And the fourth leg of the stool is what we call violations data or enforcement action data that kind of give banks a bit of a heads up that maybe a CRB that they're working with are maybe taking riskier activities than they would like, as shown by penalties from the cannabis agency. Because what you can and will see cannabis businesses who license might not get revoked or suspended, but maybe keep doing things that are getting them violations or things like that. It's kind of like banks get in trouble. You'd want to know if your bank is getting in trouble repeatedly by a bank regulator. Same thing applies to cannabis businesses. But to narrow all that down, basically what we're helping banks answer is a yes or no question. Is this a state-sanctioned marijuana business? Yes or no? That's kind of question one. Question two is they have to repeatedly come back and revisit that question. Has anything changed since initial onboarding of this cannabis business? Was the license revoked? Was there a change in beneficial ownership? Did they sell a license? Did the entity name change? So, so that's actually a lot of data points when you look at it.
Yeah.
And if you're a regulated bank, if you're only operating in one state, you get to know the Erik Gundersen, executive director, or the Shawn Collins in Massachusetts. You kind of have access to the data because you're a one state operator, and you can generally kind of handle it if you're just in one state. But as soon as a bank says, "Hey, I want to go bank in CRBs in different states," like every state has its own language, to some degree or inflection. So, and getting all that data from multiple agencies just gets more and more and more complex. So basically that's what CRB Monitor does, is we aggregate, standardize, deduplicate, cross-link, and build out robust profiles of the businesses, license monitoring, enforcement action monitoring, change in beneficial ownership monitoring, so banks don't have to do that. And fundamentally, all of this should save them time and money, and we'll do it better than a part-time compliance analyst.
Right. So that's the idea. They leverage the platform to lower their costs, which are then handed down to those in the cannabis space, which God knows they can use the savings wherever they can find it, especially in this economic environment for cannabis in particular. So that's so interesting. It almost sounds like, and I've had this thought before too, when we're talking about, especially with a Canra coming up next week, when you're talking about getting everybody on the same page, sharing stories, helping each other, having these types of conversations. But when you're talking about, one of the initial ideas for Canra was to help kind of standardize things across state to state to state. And that's happened at various levels. But we always talked about like, testing requirements or testing standards or packaging and labeling, or like, we've talked about, can we make the universal symbol actually universal across all these states? It almost sounds like we could hand them a recipe for like, here is a standard approach for what data you should make available and how. And by doing that, it might replace the job that you're doing, but it certainly, for the financial institutions, it would be helpful. Like, just because I know, you said like Massachusetts is a 14, Maine is a 15, but I'm sure there's states on there that are like a 2.
That's actually under protest though. So
yeah. We'll come back. We'll rescore it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's such an interesting concept to kind of wrap your brain around. How would you actually go about doing that? But at least having that type of resource available. So
you're right. And the reality is everyone wants to be special and do it a little bit different.
yeah,
So there would never be, I maybe not never.
Well, no, Maine actually stole our universal symbol. So let's
exactly
politely asked to borrow.
Yeah. So
exactly.
They're very unoriginal in the North, but
and I won't call out names on this, but because we're wrapping up this scorecard now for ahead of Canada, but I think our lowest score appears to be a 5 out of 15, 5 and 6.
So some room for improvement.
Some room for improvement. And actually, that's going to be one thing I was going to say, is this is our second year doing this. We did this last year. And the good news is a lot of agency regulators were open to talking about it. Hey, I think we're doing great. Let's have a chat and help us understand where there might be room for improvement. And again, none of this comes with, we're just trying to have some basic rubrics to measure these things. And what we've seen is a number of states have improved, over since a year ago. A couple states have gotten worse. And, why would they get worse? Sometimes it's technical. They're changing their database system, and the new system can't pull data, or they say it can't pull data, right? Which are two different things. New agency director comes and says, no, we're just not going to publish that data anymore. Why? I'm sure they have a reason. It's usually multiple cases of why, but generally in the past 12 months, things have gotten better, I would say. So that is good.
We have this transparency scorecard. And you have this rubric that's kind of grading out on the same buckets of information, I would assume. What's the underlying goal with this transparency scorecard? Is it to bring light to the conversation? Is it actually to drive these agencies towards more transparency and better understanding how it supports the cannabis banking ecosystem? What's the underlying objective here?
Yes to both of those. I don't think it's defeating the CRB Monitor's purpose because still you have to centralize and all this data. So even if you have 50 agencies publishing the same data, there's not a federal database for reasons we can talk about, but there
Right.
is no federal database of cannabis related businesses. But it's really both. It's ultimately the goal is to, at the state agency level, continue to decrease friction as friction defined as low transparency scores, and by decreasing friction, again, you increase transparency and decrease costs at banks, which gets more banks to do it. And I'm using banks to include credit. You get more banks and credit unions to do it because their cost and their ROI, return on investment calculation, cost comes down, so more will enter. And that also flows through to the cannabis businesses. And again, the good news is through CRB Monitor and or just more general transparency, costs are coming down as well. Not only is access to banking gone up, but costs have come down probably 50% or more in most states as it relates to cannabis banking. And that is a function, that is a direct function of more transparency, better software, better tools. So yes, and ideally we get a quiet side chat with an agency that, I don't want to say that they feel unfair, but like, hey, and again, we don't charge this. It's not professional services. We're not charging the agency, but we've had dozens and dozens of conversations with agencies where we kind of walk through these 3 or 4 pillars and say, hey, this is where you're a little bit light from our perspective on data sharing. And we should make this note again. You and I have talked about this a lot, Erik and Shawn. And states do have some confidentiality and privacy laws. So in some cases, the agency is a little bit hand-tied in terms of what they can publish. We do not change our score just because the agency is hand-tied. That is what it is, but it does in turn hurt access to banking. And ironically, you'll see this in states where the politicians are very pro-cannabis, but then the state itself has, I hate to say systemic, but kind of, issues relating to data sharing that actually make it more expensive or very difficult to bank cannabis in a given state. So, actually, I just noticed our lowest score is actually a 3, which is basically a 1 in each category. If we could do zeros, it would be a 0. But
Shawn, I think you had a question there.
I did, and I'm just not so upset about the 14 anymore. That said, it's an interesting dynamic though to think about, because in cannabis space, there is, especially amongst operators and patients and consumers, privacy is paramount, and there's sort of this an aspiration for privacy, but also a sort of they hold it very tightly for fear of repercussion, whether it be federal, like I might lose access to benefits or something. So it's an interesting dynamic where privacy can, or maybe a transparency, I'll use the word intentionally, can grant them access to banking. Yet there was a legitimate fear back when I began at the Cannabis Control Commission that if you publish that I am a cannabis operator, I might lose my banking as a result of it. So it's an interesting dynamic to think about, where privacy can be a double-edged sword too, just like transparency can be. It's just, I see cannabis as being a very unique industry in that sense, where it's almost like you've got to really tailor your disclosures to meet those expectations around FinCEN. And I was going to also comment that a lot of the FinCEN guidance, of course, it also ironically starts with like, bear in mind, cannabis remains illegal federally. But if you're going to bank these businesses, follow the following rules. Erik and I spent a lot of time dealing with the Cole memo, which required a lot of the same principles, at least around know who these people are, know who these businesses are, make sure you license them, keep things away from kids. So a lot of the pillars that the banking guidance is built around, our regulatory schemes were also built around. And I think there's value in sort of that synergy between the two. But I guess I would just comment on the privacy aspect being sort of a push and pull dynamic, where people cling to that privacy, and I understand why, but it might actually risk their opportunity to gain, access to banking.
Yeah, I agree. Two quick comments on that. Comment one is patient and consumer data is never available,
Exactly.
at any, or not at any discernible level. There might be macro, patient counts or
That's right.
price per unit, but that data is not available. So for the world, we have no individual patient or customer data. This is all what we call firmographic business entity information. The beneficial ownership piece is kind of what is out of the three kind of core buckets. And for us, the core buckets are business information, license information, beneficial ownership information. So where we see the lowest scores are usually around beneficial ownership data,
Not
which
surprised.
is generally more guarded by states. And so across the board, not just cannabis, right? And second, I would say kind of the concept of CRBs losing their bank accounts. That was true. It was true. I don't want to say it's no longer true, but if it's true today, it's because a cannabis company is going to bank that has a no marijuana policy instead of to one of
That's right.
300 banks that is marijuana friendly. And we could talk. That's a whole other podcast. I think about that. They don't want to pay fees. They don't feel like they should have to tell their bank whatever the reason is. And I don't get into debating that too much, but back at the beginning, that was a dichotomy where you had a bunch of data, more and more data on cannabis businesses, but only a handful of banks banking it, right? So that was true. It's much less true today, but I'll still read articles like, my marijuana business lost this kind of Bank of America. And I'm picking Bank of America out of a hat. Well, no kidding. Bank of America has had a no marijuana policy forever. So the question is, and there's multiple sides to this debate, right? But it's less of a problem today. You can get a marijuana banking account today in the most cases, and you don't have to hide it. And if you're hiding it, there's another question about that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you actually said something that I want to circle back to a little bit. And you brought up the good example when we're talking about beneficial owners, and that's typically where states will score a little bit lower. But we're talking about how in some states, things could be out of the control of the cannabis regulator themselves or the agency. And I certainly dealt with this when you're talking about our medical program and our caregiver model years ago. So my point that I want to make and have you validate or speak to a little bit, if a specific state scores a little bit low on say beneficial ownership because within their statutes or law, they have confidentiality around that stuff built in, they're still going to score a 0, but we understand, or CRB Monitor understands that it's outside of the control. So it's not a direct reflection. I just want to make sure that, no one gets upset and says, I can't do anything about this.
Correct. And that is, it's not even a caveat. It's more of a truism is regardless of your ability to control agency, and maybe we should, this is our second time trying to quantify this stuff. It's a rubric, it's imperfect, but directionally it's correct. Maybe we'll come up with a smarter way to factor in states that don't allow for UBO data to be shared. But as of today, it's basically yes, no kind of thing. So, or say, I'll just say again, without naming names, there were states that did publish beneficial ownership, and laws didn't restrict it and they were publishing it, then they just stopped, right? And I'm sure there are reasons why, but their scores go down, that type of thing. And again, banks banks need to collect beneficial ownership from businesses when they onboard. But the reason we collect it is CRBs often forget to mention all of their beneficial owners or investment companies or whatnot that oftentimes the cannabis agencies have that the banks wouldn't otherwise know. And we also, what we do is we do tie individual beneficial owners to multiple entities. So a bank is interested to know, Steve Kemmerling, he just got his license revoked. He just got 12 licenses. And this is a true case study. I won't name names, but Colorado Business X just had all their licenses revoked and the beneficial owners put in jail for drug trafficking under the cannabis agency, but they still have active licenses in state B, right? So how is that possible? Now that's the type of thing, if I as a bank or even as a regulator, I'd want to know that.
Exactly.
So it is interesting, yes.
It's the other thing that I think about beneficial ownership too is how it gets defined state by state sometimes. The thresholds, as far as I know, Massachusetts being at 10%. So if you're at 9%, there's no disclosure. then there's also the issue of control versus ownership. And so that's always been, I used to describe it in our agency as being sort of fuzzy. Like it's a squishy standard that I don't always, it's almost like the obscenity law. Like I know it when I see it. I know what control looks like. I know what ownership looks like. But do you see that sometimes where, for instance, I used to think about people are definitely going to want access to the applications for licensure. So we should publish that information on our website because it avoids the public records backlog and sort of, workload for us. But we're only gathering information at 10% and higher. So, but other states might be a higher threshold. Other states might be, we want to know everyone plus your spouse. Like I'm sure you see that data varies across the country quite extensively.
It does. It's definitely the squishiest out of the three. I say three main legs of the stool. Again, that's entity data, license data, beneficial ownership, and the fourth leg of the stool is again violations data. But it is the widest defined, and some states license individual. Illinois has registered principal officers or something like that, and where they actually license the person or persons in charge. That's not in Colorado. Does a pretty good job, and Massachusetts did a really good job of publishing all of its application documents. But then other states won't do anything at all, or they'll show one or two people. In other states, here's everybody, right? Or to point out, Massachusetts was great, but that's also hard data to keep updated too, right?
Yeah.
Entity data, not too hard. Licensing data, not too hard. Keeping the beneficial ownership data updated is a pain in the butt.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's something that you might catch on renewal. It's something you might catch on a change application. And that's always something that we used to get these requests a lot because I think people were going for banking or they were applying in other states. It was, can you confirm that my license is in good standing? And it's sure, as of this moment. Correct. Like I can take a picture and it's as of that moment, it's good. Like that doesn't mean that you're not under investigation for something. It doesn't mean that I might not tomorrow suspend your license, in a summary capacity. And so I just think that the enforcement piece is something that I think Erik and I monitored a lot across the country where we would just see press releases or headlines and knowing that the licensee had an obligation to disclose that action to us. And it's, sometimes I would get the disclosure. It's like we had a license, a settlement agreement in this jurisdiction. It's like, okay, that sounds innocent enough. And then you look and it's like, we also agreed to surrender all of our licenses. And like, it's like, oh, okay, I've got some more questions here then. And like, please hold for our enforcement team. But
that is a good use case for cannabis regulators to use CRB Monitor. I will note, we give free access to the CRB Monitor to cannabis regulators and bank regulators. Because to have that cross state, it's very similar to you're a cannabis regulator in Massachusetts, but it's hard to have a decent idea of how this actor is behaving in another state, right? So yeah.
Yeah, there's value there because to Shawn's point, a lot of these states have statutory or regulatory requirements that there needs to be that reporting, or even in some states, it's like it falls onto the agency to know what's happening if they have interests in a license in another state too. So that could be valuable to some folks. Excuse me. So I mentioned we're going to be I think all three of us are going to be at Candor next week, which will be great to see both of you in person, both lovely people. And Steve, I'm sure you're going to be talking about
what are you getting at?
These. You're both going to buy me drinks all night, right? Now,
there it is.
I'm sure you'll be talking about the Transparency Scorecard, again, bringing attention to it and hopefully having some of these conversations with folks. And but if you could ask one thing collectively of all of these regulators, let's just assume for a second all of them listen to this podcast. It's not just our parents.
They get free access to the podcast as well. We do provide free access to the podcast.
That's right. What would that one ask of them be? And I guess why? Would it be as specific as like, look, everybody's scoring a little bit low in beneficial ownership? Or would it be better understand kind of the role CRB Monitor plays and how we make your life better as regulator? What would that one thing be?
Well, it's one thing, but it ends up being many things, is take a look in your inbox, your mailbox and or email for the Transparency Scorecard, and know that we would we've already talked to probably 2/3 of the agencies, but we like visiting all the agencies once a year. And we will continue to offer, access to the database, but, take a look at where you are, on kind of a scorecard. And again, it's, I don't know, one-eyed man in the kingdom of the blind or whatever. So we're kind of like that. We are not perfect site, but we have, I think, as good of a site as anybody into this stuff. On a data point basis, where I think the biggest room for improvement is around regular and transparent reporting on violations or enforcement actions.
I could see that.
We tried to score it this year, but it was so incomplete. We had to leave it off the scorecard. Well, we show a column that's basically yes, no. Are they doing something? But it's probably 50% incomplete across the cannabis agencies. But I also think that's part of the maturity of an agency. That kind of comes last in the chronology of what you guys are working on. And hopefully you're so good that you don't have that many. But in terms of the biggest gaps, transparency on violations and enforcement actions.
That's right as far as the sequence of things, because it's also, as you're building an agency and building your regulatory scheme, like it's not the last thing you're thinking about is enforcement, but it's the last thing you're going to get to ultimately, because your first priority is applications out the door. You got to get people licensed. But then once they are licensed, it's like, okay, we're the dog that caught the car. Like now we've got to actually manage compliance but then it's like, okay, now we've got to sort of hustle through an enforcement process. And one of the things that we struggled with in Massachusetts was sort of, what does that even look like from a due process standpoint? And how do you, thankfully we just followed administrative law and procedure around, just making sure we dotted all those I's and crossed those T's. But then it came down to, do we have a hearing before the commission? Is it a settlement agreement? And then once you're in a settlement agreement, you're actually negotiating things. And is disclosure one of the things you can actually negotiate, or what is admitted to versus what is actually alleged? And so I would say it's something that became very manual for us. But at the same time, when I would read those headlines from other states, I wish I had insight into what they were deciding. And I think the other thing I'm observing from your comments too is that as a regulator, you never know who is going to be a user of that data. And so you want to make it as available or generic, but also valuable as possible. So in other words, like a bank is going to want that information for this purpose, but a city or town might want that information for a different purpose, or an investor might want that information for another purpose. And so you never know who's going to be using that data and for what. And so as clean and as objective as you can be, and as complete as you can be, allows people to use it for their sort of particular purpose.
Yeah, I'm going to say amen to that. And even if there's, even for CRB Monitor, that's still an area, a learning curve for us. Because I'll say something, and Erik's helped us with this too, and I'll meet with an agency and say, hey, we want your violations data, and I'm probably being overly broad or not specific enough. And then, this guy wants every single inspection report,
Right.
every 100-page. I'm like, no. I just want the final MOU or consent order, if there was one, like kind of that final plug statement. So we continue to refine our language, because sometimes I'll say something new that's new to us, and I don't even know how to communicate it well. That's where Erik, helps us to bridge that. I'm speaking Greek to regulators, or I'm hearing Greek type of thing. But again, myself and my whole team kind of came from the banking background. So in my mind, I'm like, well, obviously it should look like a bank consent order, like it's a one-page document that the FDIC says you're naughty,
Wouldn't that be
or
nice?
whatever. It doesn't show the 300-page report of every finding from the examiners going through the loan book or whatever it is. So, yeah. Nice.
Well, Steve, do you have anything else you want to share with all of our listeners before we wrap the conversation?
I just had one or two thoughts as we're talking.
Yeah, please.
Overall, the regulators are doing a better job, I would say. And again, we're looking at year-over-year kind of scores, and as it becomes more business as usual, regulators can catch up on violations data or publishing data or adding data elements as we get more into business as usual. So that's kind of the trend is positive overall.
Great.
Again, there are idiosyncratic instances of negatives. One question I do think maybe actually interested to get your feedback on is there's a piece of cannabis banking which is coming under more question of whether or not banks need to do this, and this is on the POS and or metric transaction monitoring, meaning transaction by transaction, I would say atomic level analysis of transactions that maybe 5 to 10 years ago when banks were starting to bank cannabis and regulators didn't really know what was out there, seemed like a good idea. Although FinCEN does not actually explicitly say that. They do say banks, hey, you should watch out for anomalies in transactions, which banks already do. But this concept of looking at metric ERP data or POS data is very expensive, hard to know if it works and does what it says it does. And just bank regulators I'm talking to are saying, I don't know if you need to do that. Like, we don't do that for any other industry. So it comes back, are they licensed or not, is kind of the questions. I know what you guys have seen during your time and since then as it relates to because that's one area I should note, that's one area Super Monitor does not cover because it's not public record. You have to get direct access to CRB's point of sale data and or ERP data, metric type data.
Right.
So curious what you guys think about that, if anything.
Yeah, I mean, I actually ran into, I think it's getting to the question that you're asking, but I alluded to earlier, the caregiver program very early on when I was there was confidentiality built around that. So the credit unions and banks in Maine that had banked them for a long time, apparently there was I don't know if there was a change in leadership of the federal bank regulators or just how they were going to approach it or some of the criminal activity that, surprise, surprise, was operating. But the federal regulator said, since we can't get this information the banks were saying, since we can't get this information, we actually do need access to some of this POS system data. And the conversation, of course, circled back to Metric, the track and trace provider for folks in Maine. The problem was that those caregivers in the medical program weren't required to use inventory tracking system or Metric in this case. So we're kind of at a dead end, but there was the conversation around using it for getting at what I think you were getting at. But I think that was to kind of fill a void of these other pieces of information that were not available to them, or because there was a higher level of scrutiny or microscope under that program, and probably rightfully so, if we're going to be honest. So I mean, it seems like a bit much for me, but then again, I'm not from the banking world. I'm not a banking regulator. I don't know. And I think we're probably, the longer that this thing goes on, the more mature we get and the industry itself begins to professionalize itself a little bit, it might be a little bit of overkill.
I would agree. I think I think, Steve, to your observation, it was one of those things that as we started this industry, there was a lot of, we can always ratchet that back or we can always relax that standard, but you have a very hard time ratcheting things up or tightening standards. And so you don't want to regret it for not doing it. And also it became sort of a selling feature of, it sort of proved, back to my earliest comments of like, you've got to prove credibility. It was like, we have insight and access into the daily transactions. And the banks were like, well, we want that. And it's like, okay, well, why exactly? And then they would say, well, we have these obligations. And if we can show our federal examiners that we have this granular data, that means we're really watching these guys. And I think keeping in mind, and sort of Erik alluded to the federal aspect too, is like, in the eyes of the federal government, these are still drug dealers, and they're still violating the Controlled Substance Act. And so I think it's an example of like, we've matured to the point where we probably don't have to monitor it to that level. And I think also to your point though, that's like a Herculean lift and task of such granularity, especially when you start thinking about state over state or multiple stores in one jurisdiction, to reconcile all that data. And for what, at the end of the day, I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze there anymore. Especially since you're still filing your suspicious activities reports, you're still filing your cash transaction reports. And my observation is that the feds have insight and access to all of this data if they want it anyway. So, is it just another set of eyes monitoring the same transaction data, which is also reported data? It's not as if it's necessarily I hate to say it's not that it's not accurate, but it's just data that's put in. So, I think it's just how reliable is it from an admissibility standpoint? I'm not totally sure, but yeah, I would say early on, I understand the rationale for it because we had a lot of eyes on us and it was a matter of, we have this feature, let's turn it on. But yeah, I would say it's sort of run its course in my opinion.
There's a couple sides to that debate in my world as well.
Can only imagine.
And then POS versus metric. Right?
Good point. And even that reconciliation at some point too. Yeah.
Yep. Cool.
Good. Thank you guys. This was fun.
Yeah, no, it was great having you. Second guest of the pod. We should get you a plaque.
Have to send him a hat.
We can give it to you when we see you in Denver next week. And,
there we go.
So great to see you, Steve. Thank you for joining. Best of luck, and look forward to the conversations with cannabis regulators next week.
Great. Thanks. I'll see you
All right.
in Denver.
Take care. All right. I think it's Shawn. I think it's time for a new segment. Cannabis headlines, where Shawn and I talk about catchy or relevant or attention-grabbing headlines. And I brought this one up and proposed this as a segment for this podcast based off a tweet that you had sent that caught my attention. I actually really liked it. I'll give you props for this tweet.
Hey, all right.
And the tweet was, leave it to Beaver policymakers, pass leave it to Beaver era policies. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think it was leave it to Beaver era lawmakers. Yeah. So you're talking about Texas. And their, I don't know how to describe this. Their
ban.
Yeah, let's call it a ban.
Let's get,
because I have like more descriptive characterizations for it. But
Shawn, how do you feel about it? How do you feel about it?
I have feelings, and I appreciate you asking me what they are. I don't understand it. I'll just be blunt. I don't understand the logic of a ban. Actually, we talked a little bit about this with Mackenzie on our last episode around like bans not really being the best policy choice. If you had to put the whole spectrum of options on the table, I would say ban is probably like the least productive, because it's my theory generally is if people aren't following your rules today and you have this concern around like kids getting access to these illicit market products, what is another law going to do to prohibit that or prevent that outside of maybe some enforcement? But like, I think resources are better spent on things like, I don't know, in education and in actual enforcement of regulations and rules. And I just don't understand the logic of a ban, especially with an industry. One, if you're looking at hemp, it's federally legal. So that's going to be something that's got to get squared and reconciled. But then similarly, like this is an industry that's like, it's hemp, it's farmers, it's local manufacturers, it's Texas. Like the whole, like the dynamics are there. The environment is there. It's ripe for regulation, for revenue. Like tax it, by all means, tax it. But to just ban it to me is sort of a short-sighted policy. But I think it still proves to me that there's a stigma when it comes to things like THC. And I think there's still a misunderstanding as to what hemp is, what hemp can be. But this is also a lot of fallout from, this is what happens when the Farm Bill creates a bit of a loophole that folks want to exploit.
That's
the other thing that's I'm sort of wrestling with too is like the hemp industry at large is literally asking for rules. They want to be regulated. And instead of meeting them even like 70% there, you're just like, nope, ban, done, off you go. Again, I don't, that's sending people to harm because those dangerous products are still going to be out there. You're avoiding revenues, which could be profitable and sort of beneficial to the state. And also I think just sort of, thumbing your nose at a local industry, like the Texas hemp farmers and manufacturers, like those are your constituents. So again, I have thoughts, but yeah, I think it's a leave it to Beaver era policy from leave it to Beaver era
politicians, lawmakers.
Sorry, that's my Northeast smugness coming out. So
yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I'm not surprised. We're talking about Texas. And I always try to like put myself in the shoes of other people and kind of understand
In
their
the
rationale
in the
and
cowboy
thinking.
boots of other people.
Yeah, but all the points that you made, it's really difficult here. But I'm not going to say that. Look, I'm not a representative from some House district in Texas that thinks that this is the best thing for their constituents or their state in general. But in like preparing for this exercise, like I know where I stand on this, very much aligned with you. Like there are better ways if we just kind of sat down and thought about it for a little bit to address this, to address what they're trying to address. But as part of that exercise and thinking, I'm like, all right, like what are some of the reasons that they can hang their hat on why they think it's a good thing? The problem is if each example, so use like public health, for example, like, all right, there's like a lot of unknown or synthetic cannabinoids in these products that don't have risk profiles. We don't know the long-term health impacts. All right, let's go ahead and ban it and send a clear message that we're protecting public health. Yeah, but like the counter argument is, well, why don't we prohibit synthetic cannabinoids and then regulate the rest? Or like youth access. We just want to send a clear message that this is dangerous and shouldn't be in the hands of youth. Like you can say that, but like we know that doesn't work, right? And the last one is like, and I read this one somewhere, so I know this was part of the discussion, was like the clear enforcement. Like we just draw that black line down the middle, like we know what we can enforce against. Like, yeah, I understand that, but that doesn't make this crappy policy any better. So
No.
I tried to put myself in their shoes, but like every time you go through this exercise was each like reason or rationale. It's just like, yeah, the counter argument is just way better. I don't know.
It's funny you mention that because I'm always like, the policy is so nuanced that it's easy to be like, whoa, that's too complicated. Maybe we hold off.
Yeah.
But I think you look at their medical program, I'd say their medical program, and I look, if anyone from Texas wants to talk to me, I'm happy to have a conversation. But I'll say this, I think your medical program is too narrow and therefore too limited. But why not look at that and say, we only want these products to be available through our medical program? But like to your point, like there's a line I can draw and say, if it's not in one of our dispensaries, then it's not allowed. Or if it's not in our liquor stores, then it's not allowed. But you can draw the line somewhere beyond no. And I think by saying no, this reminds me of sort of the like E-Valley conversations we were having pre-COVID, where it was like, we got to get vapes off our shelves. It's like, whoa, if the problem is the illicit market vapes, then let's have a sort of let's make people more aware of the legal products that we are quality testing and that we are ensuring we know the ingredients of.
Let's promote.
Let's have them like, let's funnel people toward the safe stuff and avoid the bad stuff. And we can say it's safe because we test it. And that's where I struggle sometimes with like and again, it comes off as sort of an era for me of like weed bad equals no. And I just don't think, I don't see the logic of it. And so I do have strong feelings about it, but it's really just because I think this policy is, I think sadly, like, and I don't mean this to be like dramatic or overly dramatic, but I think you're pushing people toward the harm. And again, if someone's not intent to follow your laws today, what logic suggests or dictates to you, let's put more laws for them not to follow?
You are pushing them towards the harm. I mean, there's hard data in research and study, and we did one here in Maine too. Like when we're trying to measure whatever it may have been in our adult use, our medical and illicit markets up in here in Maine, like there was a stark difference between health outcomes dependent upon where you access your cannabis. And guess what? You had a lot better health outcomes if you got it from a regulated source, like across the board. So yeah, you're 100% pushing them towards the risk. But I'm over here smiling and giggling at the idea that somebody from Texas is actually listening to this and they're just like these liberal Yankees up there in the cushy New England telling us what to do in Texas.
I'm just like, I'm thinking to myself, because I've retweeted or like tweeted at the lieutenant governor so much in like the past week that I'm sure there's someone monitoring something on my account, or like at least has like me flagged. I don't plan on flying into Texas anytime soon, but if I do, I'll certainly, keep my head on a swivel. So
poor Texas.
Yeah.
I think if anybody in Texas wants to have actually an adult conversation about regulating THC or cannabis and doing it in an effective way that actually addresses the things you're trying to address in a much different, or not different, in a better way, Yeah, Shawn, I think Shawn and I would have that conversation.
For sure. And also, back on my soapbox for a minute, I think the future is sort of here as far as cannabis consumption and sort of delivery methods and routes. And I think, a lot of these conversations swirl around beverages and hemp beverages. And I just think the market, there's a reason that people are buying them. There's a reason that people are making them to sell them, because people actually buy them. And I just think depriving someone of that choice, it feels very anti-Texas to me, when you're denying someone an opportunity to consume an adult beverage. Like, that's the thing that's like, I just can't square in my head of like, where's the libertarians in this? Like, where's the Republican Party that I sort of grew up with that's like, I have rights. But again, my theory on that is like, I think you're safer to regulate something. And then once you regulate it, you then create that, to your point, like that bright line to say, you're either on the legal side of this or you're not. And then put your resources and your energy and your money into education and into enforcement, and ensure that your citizens have both access to, and then second, access to safe products. But again, I think the market is proving that beverages especially are a sought after market and segment of the market, and your solution is to take them off of shelves. And in the process, though, hurt Texas businesses. That's the part where I'm like, I don't understand that logic in particular. Like, even isolated to Texas manufactured products, like, go big, go for Texas products, but nope, ban, just ban. It's like, don't do drugs, kids. Like,
Say no to drugs.
it's leave it to Beaver, and who's the other guy? Who's the mischievous guy there?
This is your brain on drugs with the frying egg.
Seriously,
Texas.
It's like Nancy Reagan is like, reincarnated, and she's a Texas representative. So, nonetheless, hey, that reminds me. Speaking of, trivia. I don't know how there's no segue there, so sorry.
No, it's good. I like
that
it.
reminds me of, speaking of Nancy Reagan trivia. You want to do some trivia today?
To be honest, we talked about this off screen, and I forgot to do a trivia question, so I actually just typed in one. Give me a random trivia question. So
it's the same as always.
I have one. I have one. It's pretty embarrassing.
Did it stump you as well?
But no, it didn't. I'm pretty sure you're gonna get it, but it's like this is a pretty half-ass
state
effort.
Got a 15 on the CRB Monitor Transparency Score.
It's a pretty half-ass effort on my part, but we'll do it anyway for sake of the segment, just to keep some consistency in this podcast.
Yeah. What do we scoreboard is what? Is it 1-1? Even though we've done 3 episodes?
We've done 3 episodes. I think I've gotten 2. I think you may have gotten 1.
2?
1.
All right, we'll check the scoreboard. Survey says.
All right, let me just ask this question and get it out of the way, because it's ridiculous. All right, which of the following, I'm so embarrassed for even asking this. Which of the following is not a real cannabis strain? A, Pineapple Express. B, OG Kush. C, Purple Haze. Or D, Cactus McMuffin.
I'm going to go D. And final answer.
You're correct. It's Cactus McMuffin.
Really?
I don't even like.
Well,
Google wasn't even trying with that. They're just like Cactus McMuffin.
You must have the free version.
Oh my God.
You're in the trial version of.
Well, guess what?
The computers are not taking over yet, folks. Don't worry.
No. We're all safe. But hey, listen, the silver lining there is you've added another point.
That's it. Yeah. Scoreboard.
Cactus McMuffin. We should find a way to incorporate we should have a segment called Cactus McMuffin.
I think we should have a character. One of the cartoons that we come up with.
Okay.
So mine's on topic because we had Steve on, and thank you. On this month's episode, Erik was responsible for booking. So thank you for bringing Steve on and enlightening us and our listeners about, I think, just what goes into banking cannabis. And I think sort of the supporting folks that are around that industry in that space that I think are doing really interesting, good, novel work to ensure that these businesses have access to things that otherwise we would take for granted. But Steve was really insightful about just what goes into banking and sort of the data monitoring that he and his team do, and they do a great job of it. But it got me thinking about banking in particular and banking the cannabis industry. And one of the things that we talk a lot about on on Capitol Hill and the federal government is different proposals, and one of them is safe banking. And it's been something that's been pending for a long time on Capitol Hill. It seems to have this sort of broad support that, yeah, we should absolutely bank these businesses, but it never seems to pass or get to the president's desk at least, which got me thinking of, it's passed like a bunch of times. So the question is, in what year did the House of Representatives first pass the Safe Banking Act? Which, if folks aren't familiar with the Safe Banking Act, it's mostly allowing explicit banking provisions, but promotes banking transparency generally. So in what year did it first pass?
I don't know, but I feel like I can probably get pretty close. I mean, I feel like safe banking, I always call it Lucy in the football, because every time it rolls around, everybody's like, oh, we got the votes. They're going to put in this package. Like, we have commitments here. It's going to happen. In the last minute, it's like, whoop.
Every congressional member that I've seen give a speech to any conference on Capitol Hill has been like, and we're going to get safe banking done. And it's like, now it's like a muted round of applause. It's like a golf clap. Like, sure you are. Sure you are. So what year did it first pass?
I'm going to go with what my head's saying, not my heart. 2019.
Bingo. Nailed it.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good guess.
Educated guess.
I mean, I'm actually kind of pissed that
I
you
got it.
Yeah, because you didn't do any homework. You did no homework.
I mean, I really thought the very first question where they answer, I came up with tummy troubles. I thought I had tummy troubles, but nope, I came up with 2019.
Yeah, that's that's a good guess, but I think it just goes to show how long banking has been an issue and just how long it has gone unanswered by the federal government, which also means if you're a betting person, again, like if anyone tells you that something's going to happen in Congress, just question them.
Just say you're wrong.
Just be like, I don't buy it.
You have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah. When I first got into the Cannabis Control Commission, it was like, when do you think they're going to legalize federally? And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I could tell you when I think, but it's literally, it's like Erik playing trivia. It's just a guess. It's just a guess.
Nobody knows what's going to happen. Nobody knows what he's going to ask or say.
Nope. No one knows what's coming except for tummy troubles.
With that, good fourth episode, Shawn. I think it was a good fourth episode.
Yeah.
Thank you to Steve Kemmerling again from CRB Monitor joining us, talking about banking, cannabis banking, the need for transparency, and hopefully some listeners kind of understand like the value that team does to just the entire cannabis ecosystem, including the cannabis agencies as well. I got you again on trivia. Cannabis McMuffin.
Yeah, really stumped me on that one.
Cannabis
really.
McMuffin. All right. Well, till next time, Shawn, you got any closing thoughts before we let people get on with their lives?
I think just to align myself with you, I think this was a great episode. So thank you for continuing to sort of stay the course with us. If you are listening at all and still listening, hi, Mom. Look, I think bringing Steve on is a good example of what we're trying to do with this podcast as well, which is illuminate different aspects of the industry, to introduce folks that you may not know are out there doing their thing and bringing value to an ecosystem that a lot of people are rowing in the right and same direction toward, and trying to just add their level of expertise to it. And so the more we can do that through this podcast, generally, I think it's a value add to an industry that both you and I have spent a lot of time around, but also I think have a lot invested in just personally and sort of, in our careers and some of our regulatory roles. So I look forward to seeing you in Canberra. Yes, and and we'll be back before you know it with episode 5, 6, 7, 8, etc. If you have a topic you want us to cover, if you have someone you think we should talk to, we have social media. It's Instagram at The Hybrid Pod. Certainly would love to hear from folks there. And then both Erik and I are available. I think I make sure I put our contact information in some of our episode notes and that sort of thing. But, Erik's doing his thing out of, is it ERG Strategies?
You got it.
And then THC Group is also out there doing its thing. So, that's it. We'll see you next time, I guess. But like, subscribe, do all the things that people are supposed to do with podcasts, and we'll see you when we see you.
All right. See you in Denver, brother.
See ya.
The hybrid.